Good day, folks. It's Alex Guest here from Alexander Guest Historical Channel. This is my video on my thoughts on the origin of the Cerne Abbas Giant and what the figure represents. Standing on a hillside in Dorset is the chalk-cut hill figure known as the Cerne Abbas Giant. To this day, no one knows who the figure represents or when it was cut. In recent times, archaeological studies on the figure have turned up some dating with dates which range from the early medieval period to Tudor times. However, I believe it is possible to explain exactly who the figure represents, taking into account recent archaeological dating methods. Let me explain. Now, most people who look on the figure remark on how much the figure is similar in appearance to Heracles. I'll just get up Heracles here, who is the hero of Roman mythology. This figure was, of course, based upon an earlier mythology, that of classical Greece, where Hercules originated, not as Hercules, but as a character known as Heracles. This figure was absolutely central to the entire mythological corpus of classical Greece, and without going into too much detail, did indeed wield a club similar to Hercules. But Hercules, or Heracles, was from the mythology of a foreign country, and whilst the earliest references to the giant were from the 17th century, the figure does still seem very ancient to some and would seem to depict a figure from ancient mythology. There's simply no way to prove that the Cerne Abbas Giant is Heracles or Hercules, or indeed not. My hypothesis takes a different direction and proposes a different figure to Heracles in what I believe is a compelling argument. Now, in ancient games held in classical Greece, many people are aware that the male contestants took part naked. That is to say, they wore no clothes. However, they weren't completely naked. There was one item of what you might loosely call clothing, which was used by the athletes, all male of course, to maintain public decency, and that was called a kynodesmy. And that's an example of a kynodesmy. The literal translation of this word from Greek to English is something like a dog lead, and was a strip of leather which was used to tie around the waist and around the foreskin to keep it closed so the glans penis could not be exposed for public decency. Kynodesmy were also used in other ancient cultures such as Rome and the Etruscan culture, where the kynodesmy was often more known as a ligatura praeputii or fibula. Now, on inspection of the giant, one can see a pair of lines on either side of the penis traversing the body at waist height. It has been noted and widely accepted that in relatively recent times, nobody knows when, the giant had a navel in addition to a penis, and that someone had the notion to join up the end of the penis with the navel to give the giant what appears to be an erection. Therefore, going back to how the giant originally looked with a smaller penis, which ended roughly at the height of the lines traversing the body, which would be here, this would indicate that the giant was wearing a kynodesmy and not a belt, as some people would assert. In fact, if it were a belt, one would expect there to be a double line around the giant's waist. But there is only one line in two parts evident today, and this is also what shows on the LiDAR data. And as I say, I think trousers can be ruled out as there are no hemlines visible in the LiDAR data in the giant's ankles. Now I'd like you to take a look at this statue, which resides in the Greek National Museum in Athens, Greece, known as the Artemisian bronze, which I have seen for myself and stood not 6 foot away whilst a tour guide slipped a piece of paper underneath his front foot, down here, to indicate that the figure was about to hurl the object and how dynamic he was and how well sculpted he was. Um, and this statue is believed to be, by most scholars, either a representation of the Greek god Zeus or of Poseidon, as whatever this figure held in his right hand is no longer extant, leaving only a hole in his grasp, which would be up here. So nobody can verify which god exactly which was represented in the statue. If it was Zeus, it should have been a thunderbolt. If it was Poseidon, it should have been a trident. But general consensus is that it represents Zeus, and I will move forward on this understanding that this figure does indeed represent Zeus, the chief deity of the Greek pantheon of gods. If we compare this particular statue with that of the Cerne Abbas Giant, we can see that there are stylistically some similarities. Firstly, these are both representations of the nude male form, both bristling with muscles on the torso and, of course, exposed genitals. Note how the feet are turned to one side on the giant, just as the feet are in the statue. Also note that the arms in both cases are outstretched. There is considerably more elbow to the giant compared to the statue, but the arms are outstretched. Lastly, notice the similarity in the right hand of both, as they both hold an object, or used to in the case of the bronze. The giant, of course, wields a club, or does it? As I just said, the Artemisian bronze should have held in its right hand a thunderbolt, if it were a representation of Zeus, as one of the key attributes of Zeus was his status as sky god, responsible for weather and atmospheric phenomena. This is widely known and understood. It is assumed that the giant wields in his right hand a club, hence the modern association with Hercules or Heracles. However, we don't know what the giant holds. We don't know that what the giant holds was originally meant to be. It could have been a club, but it could have been something else. Indeed, it could well have been a thunderbolt, as there is no generally standardized stylistic way, historically speaking, to depict a thunderbolt. And there are some depictions of thunderbolts there, and you can look it up for yourself. They range in all sorts of different stylistic styles. But they are generally seen to be long staff-like objects with small leaf or spiked projections along its length. So there's some examples. So does this mean that the Cerne Abbas Giant was a representation of the Greek god Zeus? Well, here there would seem to be a problem. That problem, of course, geography. Britain is many miles away from Greece, and if the giant were a representation of if the giant were a representation of Zeus from classical times, why would it have been carved on a hillside in what is now southern England? Well, it must be remembered that Zeus was a Greek representation of a divinity which has many different equivalencies. As a sky god, Zeus is the equivalent of the Norse god Thor, who is similarly a sky god and who wields a hammer as a representation of his ability to produce thunder. Zeus is also a counterpart to Jupiter of the Roman pantheon, just as Heracles is the counterpart to Roman Hercules. And Jupiter holds the same attributes as a sky god as Jupiter does, the king of gods and the god of the sky of thunder, lightning, and weather and atmospheric phenomenon, even in some instances of the sun. Indeed, Jupiter also wields thunderbolts as a defining characteristic of his divinity. So the sky god has many different forms across the old world in the pre Christian era, with many different names in different cultures, but is basically the same entity. It's not so well known that in the Iron Age, in the territories held by what we now call the Celts, there were many gods as well, and one of them held the attributes which were exactly analogous to Zeus, Jupiter, and indeed, ultimately, Thor of the Norse pantheon, and a whole lot of other gods who held similar position in different mythologies. This Celtic sky god's name was Tyrannus, and here we have a representation of Tyrannus. The worship of Tyrannus has left only fragmentary remains, largely in Britain, France, and Germany, the old Celtic heartlands, but there are still some artefacts which prove his existence. Tyrannus' name ultimately derives from the Celtic word for thunder, and he's often depicted holding a thunderbolt, like Zeus or Jupiter, and this is it here. That's his thunderbolt. But in addition, he is often depicted holding a spoked wooden wheel, like a wagon wheel. That's it there. This is supposedly due to the fact that the sound of the wheels of chariots driving across the land was what caused the sound of thunder, just as the Norse believed it was Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, being struck, which caused the cause of the sound of thunder. Now, I'd like you to take a look at this statue of Tyrannus held in the Museum of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France. It is unmistakably a statue of Tyrannus, as the object held in his right hand is representation of a thunderbolt. In addition, he has a face and hair very reminiscent of the popular image of Zeus, and around his waist is what can only be described as a kynodesme, just as the Cerne Abbas Giant wears around his waist. This has to be the answer to the old age question of who the hell is that regarding the giant. It is none other than a representation of the Celtic, ancient British, perhaps, sky god Tyrannus. Indeed, nor does the examination stop here, as the giant is located on a hillside, at the top of which lies an ancient hill fort, which is something like 2,500 years old. Known as the Trendle, and this is the Trendle here. The etymology of the Trendle is basically a roundel, a circle, or a wheel. And of course, the other name for the Trendle is the frying pan. And one of the key attributes of Tyrannus is that he is associated with a wheel. I believe that is why the hill fort above the giant is known as the Trendle. It's because his name alludes to one of the key attributes of Tyrannus, the wheel or the Trendle. And in John Hutchins' account of the giant published in the History of Antiquities of Dorset in 1774, he describes there having been some Arabic numerals carved below the chalk figure. Excuse me. These numerals were 748, or he describes them as being 748, which have since been lost, but hints of them show up in the LiDAR scans. And if I can get the right picture, there are some slight markings underneath there, which could be the remains of the figures that John Hutchins was alluding to. I believe it's possible that these numerals were not in fact numerals at all, but were eroded letters which spelled out the name Z A S, a variant of Doric spelling of the name Zeus. So it would have been Zas or something like that, Zaius, therefore raising the possibility that this representation of Tyrannus was also known by the name of its Greek counterpart, Zeus. So what are we to make of this figure from the iconography? From the iconography of its form, confirmed by LiDAR scans, we can deduce that in all likelihood it is a representation of the ancient Celtic sky god Tyrannus, but it was cut not in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, but in probably an Anglo-Saxon early medieval context. And it has been recorded that there was a pagan god known as Helith or Hail, which was venerated by the local Anglo-Saxon tribe or society in the vicinity of Cerne Abbas in the early medieval period. And this is details of this god and his veneration can be found online, including William of Coventry's account of St. Augustine having destroyed the shrine of the local pagan god, probably Helith. I believe that this was the original purpose of this chalk carved figure, as a figure of veneration carved by the local pagan population who lived in the vicinity of Cerne Abbas in the early medieval period, representing a god known to them as Helith or Hail. Although the modern world now accepts Wessex to have been a wholly Anglo-Saxon Germanic populated polity, it must be remembered that in purely archaeological terms there is very little evidence of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, which was held to be historical fact until relatively recent times. Excuse me. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the founder of Wessex as Cerdic, a Celtic name, and the banner of Wessex, right up until the Battle of Hastings in 1066, was a red dragon, a symbol used by the early Welsh, i.e. Celtic kingdoms, and currently resides on its national flag. Indeed, in the entry for 710 of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it records a battle which was called the Battle of Hehil between Geraint, King of Dumnonia, which is Cornwall and Devon, and Ini or Ini of Wessex, in which Geraint was the victor. So it would seem to me that although there may have been undoubtedly Anglo-Saxon influence in the Kingdom of Wessex, there must have been a considerable amount of continuity from the old Brittonic, Celtic, post-Roman kingdoms of the south of England, and the newly established polity of Wessex containing large amounts of ethnically British, i.e. ancient British, populations interspersed with newer established Germanic villages and societies. In such a milieu, it is not extraordinary to accept that there could well have been a population of mixed Brythonic and Anglo-Saxon ethnography in the area around Cerne Abbas, who were pagan and who worshipped a god which traced its origin back to the old sky god known in earlier times as Tyrannus, and who was the local variant of both Jupiter and Zeus. Indeed, I feel it highly likely that the Battle of Hehil in 710, mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and was also mentioned in the Welsh chronicles, or the Annals of Wales, in 721, was fought in Cerne Abbas area, and it derived its name directly from the giant, who was known at the time as Helith or Hail, or Hehil, hence the Battle of Hehil. It is even possible that the numerals or letters between the legs of the giant actually originally spelt out the name of Hail or Hehil, or some variant of that nature. Now, not 5 minutes walk from the giant, there is the spring known as the Silver Well Hearth, or used to be until it got the name was changed to St Augustine's Well. And the name of the battle hail may have originated in the Old English word helith, meaning health, with the spring being associated with healing, and the giant as a representation of the sky god, and named Health, indicating that the well and giant figure were associated primarily with healing. So that ends the video, and thanks for watching. Put any comments that you might have below, and thanks for watching again. Cheers.